It started with a single notification on my phone, the kind you barely notice at first. The kind that feels routine until you realize later it was the moment everything shifted. My Wi-Fi router had briefly disconnected and reconnected, a normal hiccup in a quiet suburban neighborhood where nothing dramatic ever seemed to happen. At least, nothing dramatic until an HOA Karen decided that the invisible waves carrying my internet signal were a direct threat to her authority, her control, and her imagined version of community order. The neighborhood had always been marked as peaceful, well-maintained, and strictly regulated. The HOA prided itself on uniform lawns, neutral paint colors, and an endless list of rules that most people followed, simply to avoid attention. I was one of those people. I paid my dues on time, kept my yard clean, and stayed out of HOA politics. I believed that minding my own business would keep me off the radar. That belief would turn out to be painfully naive. The Wi-Fi router in question sat inside my home, tucked away on a shelf in a small home office. It was modern, standard, and approved by my internet provider. It emitted no lights visible from outside, no noise, no disruption. The only unusual thing about it was that I worked remotely, which meant my internet usage was heavier than most of my neighbors. That single difference would become the seed for an obsession. The HOA Karen had been watching for a while. I didn't know it yet, but she had noticed delivery trucks, service vans, and occasional late-night work sessions through my window. In her mind, those details didn't add up to a normal homeowner. They added up to suspicion. And in HOA logic, suspicion demanded action. It began subtly. Anonymous complaints about unapproved electronic equipment. Vague emails sent by the HOA board reminding residents that all external signals and devices must comply with community standards. I read them and assumed they weren't about me. After all, my router was internal, invisible, harmless. But Karen had already convinced herself that my internet activity was somehow interfering with her life. She claimed her television buffered whenever I logged on. She believed her smart doorbell malfunctioned because of my signal. She told other neighbors that her sleep was disrupted by electromagnetic interference. None of it was real, but in her mind, it didn't have to be. Perception was enough. The first formal HOA notice arrived one afternoon, slid into my mailbox like a threat wrapped in bureaucratic language. It stated that I was under review for operating unauthorized communication equipment. No explanation, no evidence. Just a warning and a request to attend a compliance review meeting. I felt confused but not afraid. I assumed it would be cleared up pizzily. That assumption shattered when I realized who was leading the review. The HOA Karen was not just a vocal resident. She was the self-appointed enforcer, the type who memorized bylaws and interpreted them however suited her mood. She had a reputation for weaponizing rules, but I had never crossed her path before. Now, according to her, my Wi-Fi router was a community hazard. She escalated quickly. The next notice accused me of violating safety standards. Then came claims of health risks, then accusations that I was running an illegal business. None of it was substantiated. None of it made sense. But each letter carried more urgency than the last, as if repetition alone could transform fiction into fact. I tried ignoring it, thinking logic would prevail. That was my second mistake. One evening, as I worked late, the internet cut out again. Moments later, flashing lights washed over my living room walls. Red and blue reflections danced across my windows, surreal and alarming. My first thought was that something terrible had happened nearby. My second thought was that it had something to do with me. The police were there because of my Wi-Fi router. The HOA Karen had called 911, claiming that I was operating dangerous equipment that was interfering with emergency communications. She framed it as a public safety concern, knowing full well that those words triggered an immediate response. In her narrative, she was protecting the neighborhood. In reality, she was abusing emergency services to settle a personal vendetta. The officers were professional and calm. They assessed the situation quickly. They had a standard home router, no external antennas, no illegal transmitters, no threat. The report ended as fast as it began, but the damage was done. The embarrassment, the intrusion, the violation of privacy lingered long after the patrol car left. Instead of backing down, the HOA Karen doubled down. She told neighbors that the police had warned me. She implied that I was under investigation. She used the incident to rally support, framing herself as a hero who had taken action when the HOA was too slow. Rumors spread, side glances replaced friendly waves. The community atmosphere shifted. That was when I realized this wasn't about WI-fee. It was about control. The HOA Karen couldn't stand that something existed in the neighborhood that she didn't fully understand or regulate. The router was invisible, which made it dangerous in her mind. And because she couldn't remove it physically, she tried to eliminate it through authority, fear, and escalation. More notices arrived. Fines were threatened. Compliance deadlines were set. The HOA board, intimidated by her persistence, began echoing her concerns without verifying them. Logic was losing to volume. Facts were losing to fear. I started documenting everything. Every letter, every claim, every date and time. Because I sensed that this wasn't going to end quietly. The HOA Karen had crossed a line by calling 911. But instead of retreating, she seemed energized by it, empowered, as if the presence of law enforcement validated her delusion. What she didn't realize was that her actions had also created a paper trail, and that trail was about to lead somewhere she never expected. As the HOA prepared to escalate enforcement actions and the Karen prepared her next move, I made a decision of my own. I would stop reacting and start pushing back. Not emotionally, not loudly, but strategically. Because she wanted a war over a Wi-Fi router. She was about to learn the difference between imagined authority and actual law. The moment the HOA Karen attempted to force compliance was the moment everything began unraveling for her. What she believed was a position of power was, in reality, a fragile illusion built on noise, intimidation, and unchecked assumptions. She had pushed the situation beyond petty complaints and nuisance enforcement. Now it was stepping into territory governed by real laws, real consequences, and records that could not be shouted away. The HOA scheduled a formal compliance hearing, framing it as my final opportunity to resolve the issue peacefully. The notice referenced escalating fines, possible service disruptions, and further safety referrals if I failed to comply. The language was intentionally vague, designed to scare rather than inform. The Karen had clearly had a hand in drafting it. She wanted pressure. She wanted submission. What she didn't know was that I had already spoken to professionals who understood both telecommunications law and HOA governance limits. I had confirmed what common sense already suggested. An internal Wi-Fi router was not only legal, but explicitly protected under federal communications guidelines. More importantly, an HOA had no authority to regulate internal networking equipment, nor to involve emergency services over imagined interference. I arrived at the hearingprepared.com and documented. Every accusation was matched with a tiny contradiction. Every claim was met with a certified explanation. The Karen attempted to dominate the room with confidence, leaning on repetition and emotional urgency, but the effect was noticeably weaker when facts entered the conversation. Her arguments sounded hollow when placed beside official documentation. The turning point came when the 911 call was discussed. Until then, the HOA board had treated the incident as an overreaction, at worst, a misunderstanding at best. But once the details were laid out clearly, the tone changed. The emergency call had been logged. The reason for the call was recorded. The responding officer's notes were factual and unambiguous. No threat, no interference, no violation. The call had been unnecessary. That single fact shifted the narrative. What had been framed as community protection was now exposed as misuse of emergency resources. What had been presented as leadership was suddenly reckless behavior. The Karen tried to redirect blame, suggesting she had acted out of concern. But concern did not excuse the reality of what she had done. She had escalated a personal grievance into a police matter without cause. The HOA board adjourned the hearing abruptly, promising to review the material. That alone told me everything. They had expected me to fold. Instead, they were now facing liability. Within days, the noticers stopped. The fines vanished from my account. The compliance warnings were quietly withdrawn. No announcement was made, no apology issued, but the silence was loud. The Karen, however, was not done. She had invested too much of her identity into the conflict to walk away gracefully. She began telling neighbors that the HOA had been pressured, that I had connections, that rules were being ignored for convenience, but her influence was slipping. People had started asking questions. Some had looked up the police call logs themselves. Others had experienced her tactics firsthand in unrelated disputes. The myth of her authority was cracking. Then the real consequences arrived. The local municipality followed up on the 911 misuse report. Not aggressively, but formally. Questions were asked. Explanations were requested. The Karen was required to account for why emergency services had been contacted without evidence of danger. It was no longer a neighborhood drama. It was a civic issue. The HOA, eager to distance itself, initiated an internal review of enforcement practices. Suddenly, the Karen was not leading discussions. She was being evaluated. Her emails were scrutinized. Her complaints were compared against outcomes. Patterns emerged that could not be ignored. It became clear that my situation was not unique. Other residents quietly came forward. Stories of harassment over minor issues. Threats disguised as reminders, rules selectively enforced. The Wi-Fi router incident had simply been the most visible escalation. What followed was a collective realization that compliance through fear was not governance. The Karen resigned from her informal enforcement role before any formal action could be taken. Officially, it was for personal reasons. Unofficially, everyone understood why. Her authority had depended on the assumption that no one would challenge her. Once that assumption failed, the structure collapsed. The HOA issued a general statement reaffirming residents' rights to internal equipment and clarifying limits on enforcement. It was bland, corporate, and carefully worded, but it mattered. Boundaries were being redrawn. Life in the neighborhood slowly returned to normal. The whispers faded. The side glances stopped. The router continued doing exactly what it had always done, quietly and efficiently. The difference was not technological. It was psychological. The fear that had allowed one person to dominate had been replaced with awareness. The Karen avoided me entirely after that. No eye contact, no comments, no gestures. She had lost not just the argument, but the stage. Control without credibility could not survive exposure. Looking back, the most ironic part was how small the original issue had been. A device no one could see. A signal no one could feel. A problem that never existed. Yet the reaction had revealed something much larger about power, entitlement, and the dangers of unchecked authority in places where people assume the rules are harmless. The 911 call that was meant to intimidate ended up documenting her actions permanently. The HOA notices meant to pressure me became evidence. Every escalation she initiated strengthened the case against her. In the end, no dramatic confrontation was needed. No shouting, no public victory lap. Just patience, documentation, and the willingness to stand firm. The HOA Karen called 911 because of my Wi-Fi router, and in doing so, she accidentally disconnected herself from the power she thought she owned. The neighborhood learned a lesson. That day, one that lingered long after the flashing lights were gone. Rules matter. Facts matter. And authority without accountability is just noise. And this time, the signal was finally clear.